This video, the fourth in this series, will be by far the most detailed, complex and historically up to date. Therefore, it is necessary that I begin by explaining a number of relevant matters, especially as my approach is both much more historical, evidence-based and holistic, dynamic and non-linear than the mainstream Western academic approach. This applies to politics, economics, history, so-called science, and any and all related matters. It is necessary to have watched the first three videos on communism and the United States' role in creating communism internationally. This video is much more general and brings us up to modern times. Each historical fact and situation needs to be remembered and kept in mind as we add more details, historical events and analysis. There is also the issue of what has happened with archive.org. Unfortunately, archive.org was forced by the United States government to stop allowing interested individuals from reading and downloading the texts that allow us to more easily find out the truth about communism. The following document explains this and who was involved. Therefore, we need to carry on without archive.org's valuable and useful assistance. In this video, an holistic approach is used as opposed to a much more conventional reductionist one. Non-linear or chaotic, dynamic and discontinuous analyses replace the linear, static and continuous methods used in Western academic circles. Excluding variables or changing variables into constants is also unacceptable. These differences apply historically, mathematically and logically. In other words, I'm trying to kill multiple different birds with multiple different stones over multiple aperiodic time cycles of varying durations, which makes things quite different from the normal Western academic or intellectual way of doing things. It also makes things somewhat more difficult and demanding. We shall begin this chapter with the great communicator himself, Ronald Reagan. Here we have a future President of the United States talking about one of his Republican presidential predecessors, Herbert Hoover.
Soviet Union and capitalist states will be inevitable. By the summer of 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke. Russia, a catastrophe. With private property abolished, factories are idle, communications chaotic, farmland fallow, Bolshevik hopes are dying in squalor and misery. When under the direction of Herbert Hoover on the left, $60 million worth of food from the United States arrives to feed the starving Russian peasants. This act and Lenin's return to limited free enterprise saves the Soviet state.
Why would a supposedly conservative Republican and businessman such as Herbert Hoover lift a finger to save the communist Bolsheviks from destruction? Obviously a rhetorical question, as the previous two videos on the Soviet Union show us how the United States was responsible for Lenin, Trotsky and the Bolsheviks taking power and defeating the White Army. But Hoover and the American Relief Administration had previous history in the form of the Commission for the Relief of Belgium. Not only did Hoover save the Soviet communists from themselves, he supplied the German army and civilian workforce with thousands of tons of food during World War One. This has been copiously documented by Jerry Doherty and Jim McGregor. History of World War One is just another example that can be added to countless millions of other cases of how history is agreed upon lies, to quote Fontenelle and later Voltaire, not Napoleon as is commonly believed. Western history is nothing but fake history and cover stories. In certain circles this is called gatekeeping, but I shall return to that topic later. Now it is necessary to show just how far back in time these fake histories and cover stories have been going on in the Western world. Jan Irvin's YouTube channel Locus Media 2 has a 12-hour series by Jacob Juhlman which goes into great detail as to how primary sources are rarer than the proverbial hen's teeth when it comes to the writings of almost all old historical sources, that is prior to 1000 AD and even later. What they prove conclusively is that there is no evidence that 90% plus of generally accepted historical figures ever existed. They only exist in the writings of scribes who were usually monks of the Roman Catholic Church, who had no primary sources, nor usually any secondary sources, nor often even any tertiary sources. Supposed original texts were invariably lost in fires, according to conventional historians. These fires supposedly occurred again and again and again in all historical times at almost all Western or European nations which had written records. This ludicrous reliance on fires as being the reason why almost no primary or secondary sources, or often even tertiary sources, exist today or in the past becomes a running joke between Irvin and Juhlman, and understandably so. Nor are there invariably any primary sources for the overwhelming majority of texts attributed to those historical figures actually having been written by those individuals, or even that those texts ever existed. There are literally thousands of other books, articles, videos and documentaries detailing how all Western history is nothing but continually rewritten fabrications and cover stories. One of the reasons why so many historians, academics and people interested in these subjects are objecting to all Western academic teaching and history is because they have seen the massive current rewriting of history that is presently happening in all Western universities and academic institutions. Because these revisionist changes are so blatantly communist, that is, Frankfurt School or woke communism, the anti-communists are publicly objecting and keep raising this issue, and rightly so. The problem for all of us is that not only is all current Western history nothing but lies, so are the older histories that existed before the current communist march through the institutions, as it is commonly called today. One alternative chronology, amongst many others, is that of Anatoly Fomenko. Perhaps the most interesting and important aspect of his work is his discovery of many duplicate histories spread across time.
The ancient kingdom of Judah, 600 BC, and the Eastern Roman Empire, 300 and 700 AD. He's going to compare it. This is what he's doing here. Remember how he did that graph? And here are profiles of the ruling dynasties. The medieval Holy Roman Empire, 900-300 AD, and the medieval Habsburg Empire, 1200-1650 AD. Look at this. Same, guys. One's a duplicate, one is real. If we arrange these profiles on opposite sides of the axis, they are almost symmetrical. Does this mean they belong to the same dynasty? Visual similarity should be questioned. To do this, we need to calculate the probability of accidental coincidence. It turns out that this probability is negligible. There is roughly 1 chance in 100 billion for a dynasty of kings in different times and in different countries to be so similar to each other. All right, literally, it's impossible. In the official dynastic history, such duplicates are found quite a lot. We have found pairs of dynasties which are now considered to be totally different, ruling in different countries in different times.
Clearly, these duplicates are just a rather obvious example of so-called history being rewritten or rediscovered. One reason for the duplicates to exist is that they were added in by scribe historians who lived centuries apart, so they did not realise that that chronology had already been used previously. We may as well end this chapter with Ronald Reagan giving us one more example of the United States ensuring that the communists took control of yet another nation, in this case China.
Stalin again signs treaties, this one with Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese nationalist representative. As this scene is being enacted, Stalin is secretly supporting the communist leader Mao Zedong. Soviet diplomacy. Meanwhile, Special United States Ambassador George C. Marshall attempts to restore peace in China. He negotiates a truce between the nationalist government forces represented by General Chang Chun and the communist guerrillas represented by General Zhou Enlai. Paper promises, and the Reds gain valuable time to strengthen their forces. When Marshall leaves, they resume the war on a vastly larger scale. By the end of 1949, China falls to the Reds. Another 700 million people under communist control.
Here it was George C. Marshall, the American Chief of Staff during World War II, and not Herbert Hoover, who implemented his government's policies. Here are some of the details of what Reagan was talking about. Marshall's truce, quote unquote, was entirely to and for the benefit of the communists and stopped the nationalists from destroying large numbers of the Chinese communists or ending the movement completely. The nationalists went along because they knew that the United States of America would destroy them if they did not allow the truce to go ahead. In the end, the Americans gave Taiwan to the nationalists and then surrounded the whole region with military bases, claiming that communism was a threat. Yet another communist lie and cover story. There is not one single example of a communist regime taking power without the US being responsible for them doing so. This applies to Russia and the Soviet Union, to China, Cuba, and North Korea directly, and to the Soviet satellite states such as Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states, etc., indirectly via the Soviet Union. It also applies to Vietnam and other communist regimes in Africa due to Soviet or Chinese Communist Party assistance. Cuba is a blatantly obvious example of how everything that is written about communism is nothing but fiction, fantasy, and nonsense. Somehow, the world's greatest superpower, the United States of America, did not and still does not have the capacity to oust a pitifully small band of so-called communists from a small island just 367 kilometres or 227 miles from Miami, the state capital of Florida. Apparently a superpower with a population approaching 340 million cannot remove a hostile communist regime which has an approximate population of 10 to 11 million, of whom an estimated 88% apparently live in extreme poverty. Very strange indeed. Unbelievable, you might say. And somehow, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, the great USA was still unable or unwilling to drive the communists out of Cuba. And so the communist dictatorship continues on, as it has since 1959. Now, if you had no idea about the role that the US played in the Bolsheviks coming to power and their role in building all aspects of the Soviet economy, bureaucracy, and no doubt the Communist Party structure as well, and you swallowed the lies about the Cold War, then that still doesn't explain why the United States of America didn't drive the communists out of Cuba after the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991. Now there was no longer the threat of nuclear war. Obviously, President Yeltsin wasn't about to launch a nuclear strike to save Cuban communism, yet the USA did nothing, and is still doing nothing, and hence communism continues in Cuba. Clearly, the USA allowed Castro and the communists to take power and have ensured that Castro's legacy continues to this day. And a very successful and profitable relationship it has been for the American military-industrial complex, the CIA, the State Department, and Wall Street financiers who have funded the ever-growing debt the United States government has created to pay for all the missiles and nuclear warheads and bases to supposedly deter the terrible communists. Not quite so good for the Cuban people, of course, but they are of no concern to either the American government nor the Cuban dictatorship. The so-called Cuban Missile Crisis is a clear example of a completely bogus false flag operation manufactured by the United States and their Soviet agents and puppets to justify increased government control, spending and interference in all aspects of the American economy, political system and society. Let us look at the evidence that the US claimed showed that the Cubans had received missiles with nuclear warheads from Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. Soviets could not have made it more obvious that they were supposedly supplying Cuba with missiles. Everything is out in the open, clearly visible, as if they wanted the world to know what was going on. Of course, the equipment on the Soviet ships didn't include any nuclear warheads or probably any missiles either. Certainly the Americans never provided any evidence that even one actually functioning missile was taken to Cuba, let alone a nuclear warhead. All such claims were nothing but CIA propaganda. That is, unless you count the empty casing of a Soviet missile on display for tourists, which you might well do if you're a communist. The Cuban Missile Crisis was only ever believed by the gullible, the ignorant and the naive, and it is still only believed by the same sort of people. Cuban communism has always been a lie and a scam, just as all communism is. There are many contributors on the subject of financialisation, with Michael Hudson and Chris Hedges being especially knowledgeable here. However, an inevitable consequence of deindustrialization is not only the destruction of civilian industries, but also the destruction of military capacity and output. Since we are concerned in this chapter with wars and empires as well, I shall focus on the effects of financialization and deindustrialization on the British Empire and now the American Empire. This video by Scrump Monkey gives us a good basis to this subject, presuming we haven't already read up on the matter. As far as Britain is concerned, Adam Curtis's The Mayfair set gives us an interesting history of the major individuals and institutions involved during the period 1950 to 2000. And we see that the Labour Party back in the 1960s had already been actively involved in this process long before Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. The Wilson government, elected in 1964, implemented their communist economic policies by using the powers of the state to force various industries to consolidate and sack many employees, with Tony Benn, the Minister for Technology, playing a major role here. The financial lies and chicanery of people such as Jim Slater, James Goldsmith and Tiny Rowland was only possible because of governments and corporations implementing Keynesian economics, which was a fraud itself, but I shall return to that topic later. With the coming to power of Margaret Thatcher, the role of the government expanded even further as it continued the march to financialisation and privatisation of the British economy and nation. Privatisation results in the financial sector having ever-increasing power over all aspects of the economy to their benefit and at the expense of the productive sectors in the economy. Instead of supposedly helping the poorer or disadvantaged sections of the economy, Thatcherism used the state to divert income and power to the wealthy. An example was how the Thatcher government set up a government body, the London Docklands Development Corporation, paid to develop the old London Docks area and then sold the properties to private corporations to sell and profit from. Of course, the government didn't profit from their selling the developed dockland to private corporations. It subsidised those corporations, giving them tax breaks and grants. The Thatcher government bore the costs and the private financiers profited. It needs to be pointed out here that since the 1980s, all Western governments have been routinely fabricating all significant economic and financial data to make themselves look better and to make the general population of each nation believe that their lives, real incomes and wealth were still improving. For example, in her first term as Prime Minister, the Thatcher government changed the way that unemployment was measured to try and make the rate seem much lower than what it actually was. This they did multiple times. The same manipulations, changes and lies were applied to the inflation rate, growth rates, levels of government and private debt, and so on. These manipulations and lies were and still are an essential feature of financialisation. Financially, the UK, the USA and all Western economies did grow and continue to grow, but real output per head per time period fell as deindustrialisation occurred due to financialisation. Probably the most extreme and well publicised example here is that of Ireland and the nonsensical economic data they have been peddling for decades. In other words, all Western economic data has been financialised and all the productive aspects of their economies have been deindustrialised. The only exception to this is Germany, which seems to have been going down the same path in the last 5 to 10 years. Now is a good time to look at the broader history of the Western world and how we arrived at this situation of Western nations destroying their own economies and drastically lowering the real living standards of their populations. An example is the extreme shortage of housing and rental properties, especially for younger people in the West. The higher personal or private debt levels, the cost of a university education, and the debt incurred from that education are just some of the many similar issues in all Western nations which have been widely discussed and analysed. Firstly, we need to understand just what type of economic system we have in all Western nations. Britain was the first industrialised nation, and it is generally accepted by economic historians in these fields that the 1780s were the period when these momentous changes became dominant. From the 1780s onward, and especially from the 1820s onward, the state in the United Kingdom began to play a rapidly increasing role in all aspects of the economy and society. The formation of the Metropolitan Police in London by Robert Peel in 1829, the introduction and gradual expansion of income tax in 1799, the growth in the role of the state in education, and the increased involvement of the government in creating the British Empire and building up the Royal Navy and the Merchant Navy are all significant here. From 1780 to 1914, the British economy could reasonably and fairly be described as a capitalist economy, though it needs to be kept firmly in mind that governments have always played a central role in any industrialised economy. From 1918 to 1939, the British and most other Western nations had a mixed economy, with private enterprise and government interventions and actions both being important. For the period from 1945 to today, all Western economies and nations have had a communist economic and political system. In the United Kingdom, the changes implemented by the coalition government of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Conservative, and Deputy Prime Minister Clement Attlee, Labour, such as the beverage health reforms, and later by the Attlee government, such as the NHS and other government programs that created the modern welfare state, meant that communism had triumphed over private enterprise in the United Kingdom. Hence, Britain finds itself in its current state. In the USA, the New Deal, which was created by Wall Street financiers, Gerard Swope initially, and implemented by them for the benefit of those financiers and associated large international corporations, with FDR being a Wall Street financier himself. Of course, communist history will tell you that the New Deal existed to help the unemployed and destitute recover from the effects of the Great Depression, but that is just another communist lie and cover story. Wall Street and FDR by Professor Anthony Sutton tells us the truth of the matter. In addition, the American government created the United Nations and its associated agencies, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations Security Council, etc., to help spread American corporate communism around the globe and to replace the old British Empire with the American Empire. As each decade went by, both the United Kingdom and the United States became ever more communist. For a while, the income from their replacing the British Empire with their own, and the profits made by extracting surplus value, to use the correct Marxist term, from the rest of the world, meant the US economy grew and they became the world's superpower. But inevitably the communist rot set in and they followed the British into a pitiful state of self-destruction, which they now wallow around in. Especially since 2010, it has been clear that the American economy has been decaying and rotting away more each year, dragging down all countries, businesses and institutions tied to its beliefs, practices and by now imaginary power. Here are a number of examples from just in the last 25 years of how once internationally powerful American corporations have self-destructed due to their communist practices. By that I mean they became powerful because they built up and depended upon deals done with the United States government and bureaucracy at all three levels, federal, state and local. This has proven to be their downfall. These firms include IBM, Microsoft, Ford, General Motors, General Electric, Boeing, and now even Intel. The economic and financial data supplied for Tesla is a mixture of fake or financialized data and some much more realistic data. In truth, Tesla has never made a profit. Of course, the reported revenues and profits of Apple and Amazon and Pfizer, etc., are also completely financialized and fake. Remove their access to their corrupt tax avoidance schemes and the trillions of fake money circulating in the United States, and their businesses would collapse into bankruptcy within a few months. The US economic data since 2010 has been even more ridiculous and nonsensical than Ireland's economic and financial data. This is due to the huge 30 trillion or so fake money slopping around in the United States economy, the massive share buyback schemes that corporations with access to those funds have then used to artificially boost their share price, and hence the bonuses for their executives, and the substituting of real GDP data with financial data that bears no relationship whatsoever with economic reality. My experience over decades of research into economic history, going back to the mid-1970s whilst at university, leads me to believe that the actual gross domestic product, net national product, and national income of the United States of America is at best 50% of the claim figures, and probably closer to only 20% of the claim figures for the period from 2010 to 2025. It is impossible to be more precise because the figures have been so manipulated and financialized that only rough estimates can be given. Insofar as the United States stock market is concerned, at best, their actual or real market indices are only 5% of claim figures, and at worst probably closer to 0.1% of current market indices and prices. When an economy is so massively in debt, publicly, privately and internationally, it has more than 20 trillion plus of fake money floating around the place, such inflated figures are guaranteed. Speaking bluntly, the only real power that the United States has left is the power of ongoing self-destruction. It is impossible to deindustrialize civilian industry and capacity without also damaging or destroying military capacity. Simple-minded reductionists will tell you otherwise, as their ideological view is based upon putting all these different sectors into separate boxes and only allowing simple linear relationships between these boxes, if they can even be bothered doing that. In reality, everything is connected to everything else in a dynamic, ever-changing and chaotic manner. The number and training and skills of the engineers, machine operators, factory workers, apprenticeship schemes, miners, diesel mechanics, etc., who keep civilian and military output flowing have all shown a steep decline in Western economies, Germany being an exception, as is shown by the long-term shortages of these trades and occupations. These shortages and declines in manufacturing output must affect military output and capacity as much as they affect non-military capacity. Hence the problems of the West has had in supplying the United States Army fighting in Ukraine against the Russians, and America's problems trying to supply their ally Israel with the military equipment necessary to attack multiple nations and peoples in the Middle East. There is a relevant example here from the history of the British Empire which illustrates this point. Back in the days of Queen Elizabeth I, at the time of the Spanish Armada, it was the Royal Navy that was responsible for stopping the Spanish from succeeding in their task of challenging the British Empire and ending or reducing the capacity of the British to interfere in Spain's removal of tons of gold and treasure from the Americas. As conventional history shows, the British were successful, but what befell the Royal Navy after the Spanish Armada limped back to Spain is not so well known, for good reason. Queen Elizabeth I had repeatedly refused to pay the British sailors fighting the Spanish all or most of their pay, even after the Armada had fled. As a result, many Royal Navy sailors became ill with scurvy, typhus and dysentery. Estimates of death range from 4,000 to 7,000, with only approximately 100 or so having been killed by the Spanish. Many Royal Naval officers saved their men's lives by turning their ships into floating hospitals and paying for the food, medicines and medical care to keep them alive. This was sensible and practical because the officers knew that their men were needed not only by the Royal Navy but by the Merchant Navy to keep the British Empire going. Britannia rules the waves for the empire in which the sun never sets, and neither does the trade ever stop. Historically, the Admiralty has played a major role in the functioning operations and the successes of the Foreign Office, the existence and longevity of the British Empire, and was also vital for the Allied victories in both World Wars. The Merchant Navy, protected by the Royal Navy, kept the British military and civilian population supplied with food and materials necessary to defeat the Germans, who suffered from food and material shortages in both wars. Royal Navy ships and Merchant Navy ships were built in the same shipyards by the same designers, tradesmen and some women, the same engineers, dock workers and boatwrights. Sailors and officers moved between both navies, and during times of war many Merchant Navy ships and crews became a part of the Royal Navy. This happened in World War II especially, and was important in the rescuing of the British Army from Dunkirk, although on a more informal and temporary basis, of course. As Britain deindustrialised from the 1960s onward, so the power and capacity of the Royal Navy and the British Merchant Navy have both declined drastically, as has the power, capabilities and size of the British Army and Air Force. There is also the issue of the introduction of Frankfurt School communist ideology concerning recruitment, training, promotions, etc., on the efficiency and enlistment rates for all three branches of the British military. Moving on to the issue of wars, there is a well-known saying that all wars are bankers' wars. And whilst that is somewhat true, it is far more realistic to say that all wars are financiers' wars. Banking is just one aspect of the whole international financial system, which is composed of the following major markets or parts. All these aspects of the financial system benefit from war and have plenty of reasons for promoting and prolonging wars of all sizes and importance. There is the stock market, the banking system, the bond market, insurance, bankruptcy, venture capital market, tax law, international accountancy firms, NGOs or near government organisations, charities, trusts, endowments and legacies to universities, institutions and think tanks. All these aspects interact and function to promote conflicts which benefit them in terms of money, power, attention and prestige. Diplomacy is also central to this whole system, as I shall explain and examine later. It is best to look at the relationship between the financial sector and wars, whilst also including the role of empires, as it is imperialism, not nationalism, which is responsible for 90% plus of all major and minor wars, and that includes coups, terrorism, false flag events, etc. This is the only way to get a more realistic and historical understanding of the situation. For any analysis or theory to be scientific or realistic, it must include all the significant variables which must interact dynamically in a non-linear or realistic manner. Whilst all history is agreed upon lies, and it is also obvious that violence, conflict and wars have been grossly exaggerated by all Western historians to try and justify such conflicts, it is also true that it is empires which have been responsible for 90% plus of such conflicts, and empires which have been responsible for those fake histories, for creating fake enemies, fake Cold Wars, etc. Communism has always been intended to be a worldwide control system with every aspect of life subordinate to the then current ruling communist tyrannical ideology. It matters not whether that is Marxism, Leninist Marxism, Trotskyism, that is New York Wall Street global financial communism, or global permanent revolution, or Frankfurt School communism, or even Maoist communism. All empires require that nationalist languages, customs, practices, education, history, religion, laws, etc. be subordinate to imperial laws, customs, education, practices, history, religions, ideology, etc. And they use force and violence to implement those aims if and when they feel they are required, which is often. Since the end of World War II, the dominant power in the world has been that of the United States Communist Empire, run from New York, using such bodies as the United Nations, which is headquartered in New York. This empire has crumbled massively due to communist self-destruction, as has been explained previously. There is little incentive or reason for a nation-state to declare war on another nation-state if they don't have imperial ambitions or capacities. Small to average-sized nations cannot afford to just attack another similar-sized nation, as the cost in money and manpower is likely to be prohibitive if they lose, or even if they win after a prolonged conflict. Also, they have to attack near neighbours, as they cannot just march to some distant land through other nations' territory. Even if they win, they will have great difficulty in maintaining power, as the logistics of maintaining and supplying their military in their conquered victims' territory is high, and the people they defeated know this. The Swedish-Lithuanian and the Polish-Lithuanian conflicts and attempts to expand their power, including their attacks on Russia, show this, as do other wars that I shall reference. They are all small, limited conflicts because the nations involved realise that the costs of continuing are too great and the benefits are too small or non-existent. We also have the case of the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s, when the Tsarist Russian Empire believed it was fighting the Japanese, when in fact Japan was just a proxy for the British Empire. Of course, the British-Japanese alliance won. Many, if not most, wars between nation-states only happen because an imperial power has supported one side and hence enabled them to attack, or has agitated within a nation-state, including bribing local officials, to try and bring about such conflicts. The wars and conflicts within Yugoslavia following Marshal Tito's death are an obvious example here. Nation-states can and have attacked smaller local nations and successfully absorbed them into their economic and political systems, but there is a real limit to such opportunities. On the other hand, powerful nation-states with pretensions to being an empire can attack other nations and take power for a greater or shorter period of time. They can then use the resources and labour of that defeated nation to try and further expand their empire. Inevitably, even the most powerful empire creates a huge number of enemies who rise up against it. The successful ones bide their time until the imperial power is weak and then strike. In relation to Germany, Bismarck created a nation-state from the Germanic people, but then German imperialism rose to the fore and caused some rather significant problems for those people and the nation-state of Germany. First, the Kaiser Wilhelm regime naively and stupidly allowed themselves to be drawn into World War I. And then Hitler and his National Socialist Party chose to try and take imperial control of Slavic and Eastern European peoples and lands to obtain what is usually called Lebensraum, or living space. Nationalists do not try to impose their nationalist beliefs and practices on other nationalist peoples or nations. That is what imperialists do. It was Germany's abandonment of nationalism and its attempt to become an imperial power that resulted in its crushing by the British and American empires. In summary, Western academics, historians and intellectuals are anti-nationalist because they are trying to promote the idea of global communist power, dictatorship and domination. They wish to see a communist imperial power rule the world. This doesn't mean that they all explicitly want that or even have any idea what such a thing means, but that they go along with their peers and the generally accepted ideology in their field, which is bringing about such a state of affairs and has been doing so since the end of the Second World War. An excellent example of a communist cover story is the lies and fantasies that are told about diplomacy, embassies, diplomatic immunity, international cooperation, and so on. International diplomacy doesn't exist to foster communication and cooperation between nation states. It exists as a power and manipulation tool or structure for empires to have power over and to threaten other nation states. In the days of the British Empire, the British embassies on the Indian subcontinent or South Africa or Kenya, etc., were there to facilitate the ability of the British to extract wealth from those colonies and to maintain their power over them. This includes paying local would-be rulers to side with the British against their nation's interests. Diplomatic immunity would allow the imperial power to bring in money to reward those in their colonies who could assist them to advance imperial aims. The British had large embassies with many specialists from the military, security, finance, education, legal and medical fields, etc., to help maintain imperial power. The Americans do the same thing nowadays, of course. Bodies such as the United Nations and all its many agencies are there to maintain and expand the American empire. Since 1945, US embassies have grown in size and power, and British embassies have declined in size and power, as expected. Two examples here are worth looking at, the first being Napoleon and his history, and the other the role of the Saigon embassy during the Vietnam War, or what the Vietnamese call the American War. Napoleon's parents had both a political family history and a diplomatic one as well. He was well connected, as they say. But the most relevant and significant issue about Napoleon was how he was not only extraordinarily well treated by the British, but indeed how he was aided and abetted by them, time and time again. Napoleon kept failing, as history shows us, yet the British kept making sure he survived to fight another day, which he kept doing. Starting with his first failure, his war in North Africa, Egypt, etc., the British Navy played an important role in defeating Napoleon's army. Napoleon then scurried away in the dead of the night, abandoning his army and without informing the generals he left behind of his intentions. The British and their allies then mopped up what was left of Napoleon's army and shipped them back to France. In other words, it wasn't Napoleon or the French that rescued what was left of Napoleon's forces, it was the British. Of course, those men then continued fighting for the French army under Napoleon. After a series of successes, Napoleon had himself crowned Emperor of Europe and later King of Italy, just as a good imperialist is wont to do. And this is whilst he was remaining true to the French Revolution, which he certainly was. After another series of defeats for himself and his allies at the hands of the Russians, he was forced by the Russians, the British, the Prussians, Austrians, Spanish, etc., to abdicate and live on the Isle of Elba. Well, live isn't really correct. Rule is far more accurate. He was carried to the island on Her Majesty's ship Undaunted, paid 2 million francs per year by the French government, that is, by the financiers working with the French government, and had a small army of 870 of his men join him. He then proceeded to build up a bigger army and a navy, and develop an iron ore mine on Elba, as iron is of some use in a war. Inevitably, he decided to leave Elba and proceeded to fail once more. Yet again, inevitably. You would think by now that his many enemies would have had him killed, but no. Once again, he was merely sent off to exile. Once again with a whole retinue of friends, colleagues and supporters. Further failures and deaths were brought to an end by his own demise. So why did the British give Napoleon such support and generous treatment? Obviously, various financiers both in Britain and in Europe made fortunes, small and large, from Napoleon's many misadventures. But there are other reasons as well. Napoleon was a true communist revolutionary, a true son of the French Revolution, a classic example of communist imperialism in which local languages, customs, laws, etc. are suppressed and central dictatorial rule takes power over everything it can. And this is why he is so praised, defended and promoted to this day. With the situation in Vietnam, notice how the United States Embassy was set up in 1952 in Saigon, and 2 years later, in 1954, the Americans had Vietnam split into North and South Vietnam, just as they had done in Korea back in 1945. They also did the same thing in China in 1949 when they gave Taiwan to the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and ensured that their trained agent Mao Zedong took power over the Chinese mainland and its population. The British did essentially the same in 1947 with the partitioning of the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan. The excellent documentary series End of Empire, made in 1985, explains very well how the then Labour government of Great Britain lit and stoked the flames of religious differences and conflict amongst a people who had lived largely peacefully together for centuries prior to 1945. Mahatma Gandhi, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Jawaharlal Nehru, the three major leaders involved in the partitioning of the Indian subcontinent, all just happened to be admitted to the bar in London prior to their activities and roles in the independence of India and Pakistan. Undoubtedly, from a British perspective, they were just the right people to be entrusted with such an important and delicate task. The British got to sell a great deal of military equipment to the Indian government and military, and the Americans got to sell a significant amount to the nation of Pakistan. So everyone was pleased with a job well done. Of course, Gandhi was killed, but sacrifices are always required in such matters. Because the Vietnamese had centuries of experience dealing with Chinese incursions and conflicts, and over 100 years of experience resisting French colonial interference and rule, they knew how to deal with the Americans once they turned up following the end of World War II. The American war in Vietnam was a great success for the American financiers, but not quite so good for many of the American troops sent there to fight. Since national communism fighting global communism is both perfectly normal and inevitable from a communist perspective, it was definitely a real win-win situation in multiple different ways and from multiple perspectives, not the least financially. The Vietnamese occupation of the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon during the Tet Offensive was a clever move in showing the American public and the American bureaucrats and military in Vietnam that things weren't as safe or under control as they wanted to believe. Having explained quite a bit about the actual history of the West since it began to industrialise back in the late 1700s, we are now in a position to understand the present global communist genocide, some of its effects on the West and why it is happening now and for what reasons. Financialisation, deindustrialisation, and the communist American empire are all central here, which is why those topics have been hopefully sufficiently covered and explained. In the past, empires, would-be empires, and nation-states had to develop their industry, farming, mining, logistics, and communication sectors if they wanted to be successful and try and retain some kind of independence if they were just a small to average nation. This meant that they needed to invest substantially in their apprenticeship and training schemes to have a large number of skilled tradespeople and factory workers to operate and maintain their economy. Economic history shows us that a considerable number and proportion of females worked in these areas, but I shall return to that topic later. These skilled workers are required for producing all goods and services, for maintaining and repairing the machines and tools used in production, and for enabling innovations and improvements to be made so that economic growth can occur. The other two vitally necessary groups here are small, medium, and a few large business entrepreneurs and engineers, who are another type of skilled worker. Skilled workers are also required to fight in wartime due to the use of modern technologies in the Army, Navy and Air Force. Since the 1970s, however, a considerable number of things began to change, in a dynamic, unpredictable and chaotic manner. With financialisation, and here the adoption of the United States dollar as the world's reserve currency was one important factor, the power and influence of the business leaders who had experience with actual production began to decline, and the power of financial specialists began to grow. More and more CEOs came from a financial background and less from a production background. Profits from real production could not compete with profits from an increasingly financialised economy, especially in the United States, but also in the United Kingdom and Western Europe. To make matters worse, the rise of computers, the international connection of those computers via the internet, etc., the use of computerized control systems and machines in factories, the rise of the number of theoretical physicists in physics, the adoption of cosmology and computerized modelling in chemistry, biology and medicine, all interacted to create a West full of deluded decision makers, propagandists and influencers who had very little or no idea of anything that is real or actually scientific. Because their approaches and practices were financially and academically successful, which they most certainly were, didn't and doesn't change the fact that they are also highly self-destructive, as history now shows us. Of course, these changes in all aspects of the economy and society affected governments, bureaucracies, the judiciary, education, etc., as is inevitable in a globally connected communist society. Certain individuals, corporations, academics and organisations such as think tanks who have experience in the world of computing and related technologies began to believe that skilled, trained and experienced factory workers, machinists, engineers, farmers, diesel mechanics, etc., were either no longer required at all or only required in much smaller numbers than had been the case. They believe that computers, computer-controlled machines, robots, and now what they call AI, can take over, cost less, and be more efficient and productive. Only those who lack any meaningful experience of actual production, machinery, factories, farming, mining and so on, and who have no idea about economic history would fall for such patent nonsense. But believe it they do. Western economic theories of all types, especially neoclassical and Marxist, further degrade their hold on reality and make them susceptible to such delusions. In a financialized system, it is necessary to try and obtain revenue and profit, financialized revenue and profit of course, from the removal of these now useless eaters, quote unquote. So we have the current ongoing genocide and impoverishment of all Western populations. As always, the state and large international corporations have been the drivers of this genocide. Historically, communist genocides have largely relied upon starvation and wars to achieve their goals. But now poisoning the food supply, the water supply, the air with chemtrails, electromagnetic radiation and pollution, and the use of medicinal poisons masquerading as vaccines, painkillers, and prescription drugs have become dominant. Add in lies about what foods we should eat, and even more lies concerning obesity, cancer and heart disease, and we have the present disgusting mess that we are in. And that's not even mentioning the genocidal effects of the psychological manipulation of people and the resulting psychological illnesses that result by all communist Western governments and their various communist outlets such as mass media and education. One of the few acronyms that has any real value and use is RHINOs. This comes from the United States and refers to Republicans in name only, but it applies throughout the Western world to conservatives or right-wingers in name only. Lenin's well-known dictum that the best way to control the opposition is to lead it ourselves has proved to be his most successful, accurate and prescient statement. Quite a bit more prescient than his claim that the capitalists will sell us the rope we will hang them with, since the Soviet communists hung themselves with that rope before his Western comrade bosses followed suit. To understand just how fundamental and important communist control, power and influence are in Western groups who claim to be anti-communist, it is necessary to look at the major deceptions that communists have successfully pulled on Western conservatives, right-wingers and anti-communists. I shall start with Marxism and Marxist-Leninism and then look at Frankfurt School communism. Most Western anti-communists have or did read the Communist Manifesto. They realise that the communists do not act in the interests of the proletariat or working class, and then believe that they have seen through the communist lies. In fact, they have fallen for them. Obviously, no communist party has ever intended to help or support workers. They just use that as an excuse to try and gain power for themselves. But the other half of essential communist propaganda is also just as false. That is, that communism is opposed to the capitalist class. In fact, communism constitutes the ideology, teaching and practices of the capitalist class. That is the international capitalist class, not small and medium businesses. It is the interaction and cooperation of large international corporations with Western governments that actually constitutes the dominant and ruling communist power within the West. This has been so since the end of the Second World War, as explained previously. Actual communism is just as hostile, genocidal and determined to extract surplus value from small and medium business as it is from employees, the self-employed and workers. Both the state and large corporations work together to do just that. Here are multiple examples of evidence that shows how communism exists because of international corporate leaders and how they try and use it to enrich themselves and increase their power and control. We may as well start at the top with Friedrich Engels, Marx's co-author of the Communist Manifesto. He also wrote many other important Marxist texts, some co-authored with Marx and others by himself. Engels was an actual international capitalist. His family owned 2 factories in Prussia and 1 in Salford, Manchester, which he managed for a number of years. During those years he supported Marx and his family financially, which played an important part in enabling Marx to write Das Kapital. Jacob Schiff and William B. Thompson are 2 highly relevant examples here, not just for their connections to Wall Street, just like FDR, but more so because of how cover stories have been fabricated to try and explain away their roles in creating international communism, and indeed Wall Street's and New York's role in international communism. This referenced article is a good example. Despite Jacob Schiff admitting his role in the downfall of the Tsarist regime, and his grandson stating that Schiff had donated millions to the Bolsheviks, and State Department and US military intelligence supplying evidence that he had done so, communist cover stories are once again trotted out, no matter how nonsensical they are. The same applies to Thompson. Richard Spencer's book, Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925, has over 280 pages of evidence on the subject and includes information on Schiff and Thompson. Professor Anthony Sutton's Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution examines Thompson's activities whilst in Russia leading the Red Cross mission. One of the best examples of how the United States of America was and still is responsible for international communism is the truth about FDR and the New Deal. Here we have an example of how leading American industrialists supported publicly the New Deal, which was meant to be for the benefit of the workers. The experienced politicians were more hostile to it, correctly understanding the attack on individual freedoms that the New Deal meant. Thomas Sowell is excellent in this area, but I shall return to his very valuable contributions later. It is opportune to comment on the matter of supposed American spies such as Harry Dexter White, Harry Hopkins, Alger Hiss, etc., working for the Soviet Union and supplying them with secrets. This is an extreme a case as you would ever likely to get of the tail supposedly wagging the dog. Of course, White, Hopkins and Hiss did pass information on to the Soviet Union. That is undeniable and has been copiously documented, but that didn't make them Soviet agents or spies. On the contrary, first Trotsky and then Lenin and Stalin were American agents who violently inflicted Wall Street communism on Russia and then the whole Soviet Empire. This has already been documented and explained previously in this video and in the other videos on this channel, so there is no need to repeat that work. FDR, Averell Harriman, Moritz Kahn, Herbert Hoover, Ford Motor Company, McKee Engineering, Vickers Engineering, Jacob Schiff, Armand Hammer, etc., 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 weren't agents of the Soviet Union. They actively created and supported the Soviet Union to help bring about global communism. And they succeeded. So now tens of millions in the West are dying as a result, just as tens of millions died in the Soviet Union and in Mao's China. We now move on to the role of the Frankfurt School, but before doing so it is helpful and no doubt necessary to mention the topic of psych washing. The term brainwashing is very well known, of course, but it is yet another example of Western reductionism, bias and simplification. The reason why Frankfurt School communism has been so successful and destructive in the West is not just down to the mental or intellectual capacities of Western populations, specifically intellectuals and academics, but even more dependent on the lack of moral decency and the lack of psychological courage of Western people in standing up to communism. It is the attitude and the strength of each person's whole psyche or psychological spiritual makeup which affects our capacity to withstand and oppose communist or non-communist genocide, lies and propaganda and those who implement them. And those capacities have been very conspicuous by their absence since the turn of the century. Prior to the 1980s, all communist regimes had depended upon American support, weapons, training, finance, terrorism, coups, etc., to take power. This was mainly due to both the peasants and workers in all nations being resistant to Marxist-Leninist propaganda. As shall be shown, all the important Frankfurt School members were intellectuals and academics. They correctly realised that trying to radicalise the workers or peasants wasn't going as Marx and Engels hoped. So they worked out a much more successful strategy of targeting academics and intellectuals in all faculties or fields, including physics, biology, archaeology, mathematics, etc., not just the so-called laughably termed social sciences. With the state and large corporations having a great deal of power over the finances and funding for universities, think tanks, the media, NGOs, bureaucracies such as education departments, and the security and military sectors, people within these institutions either complied or were purged, to use a traditional communist term. Nowadays it is called being cancelled. Because educated people usually go to university straight from school and hence lack experience of the real working world, and because they are choosing to fill their consciousness, not just their brains, with intellectual theories, ideas, concepts and arguments, they have difficulty in knowing what is real and what is propaganda, deception, lies, etc. This is especially pronounced when it comes to mathematicians, but I shall address that topic later. Add in the delusional impact of simple linear reductionist, static or pseudo-dynamic ideology, plus illogical and absurd teachings on what science and mathematics can and cannot do, plus a history that is constantly being rewritten to try and conform with the latest fantasies of those with some sort of power, and we have the current highly self-destructive and genocidal stupidity we are experiencing in the West. In other words, modern communist consciousness and reality, Frankfurt School style. To sum up then, we see all these truly bizarre behaviours and beliefs from modern Western communists, especially the young, because they have been psych-washed, not just brainwashed. Not only their intellects, but also their emotional and physical consciousness has been manipulated, twisted and corrupted, so they have been affected throughout their complete conscious psyche or awareness. As mentioned previously, Frankfurt is the financial capital of Germany, just as New York is the financial centre of the United States. During the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists came to power, Frankfurt School people left Germany, moved briefly to Switzerland, and then were taken in by Columbia University in New York. After influencing and educating New York communists, Horkheimer and Adorno moved to Los Angeles, California, the home of Hollywood. Marcuse, Lowenthal, Kirchheimer and Newman went to Washington and worked as agents with the OSS/CIA, which is a completely natural and normal career path for a communist academic. In the 1960s, Marcuse taught at the University of California for 5 years, where Angela Davis was one of his students. The Frankfurt School ideology is a bizarre mishmash of absurd, ridiculous fantasies, none of which are real or scientific on their own, let alone all jumbled together. Just as actual communism only existed due to American power, so Frankfurt School communism has only become dominant due to American financial and imperial power, not because it makes any kind of sense at all. As with all types of communism, if you oppose it when its supporters have power over you, then they will try and purge you. And it will continue on purging anyone who is not slavishly obedient to its latest ever-changing dictates. In that regard, they are all good Stalinists. Another example of how international capitalists created communism is that of Julius Hammer, father of Armand and Victor Hammer, who was one of the co-founders of one of America's early communist parties. Julius Hammer did major deals with Lenin and the Bolsheviks and trained his sons to carry on helping to keep the Soviet communists in power and develop their economy. For this they were well rewarded. The creation of fake qualifications for people who followed or would follow Frankfurt School propaganda in universities and schools, so they obtained positions they were not qualified for, also warrants mentioning. Whilst the examples given here relate to the United States, it is highly likely that similar procedures were implemented in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. The Frankfurt School approach makes for a more thorough and general psych-washing of students than Marxist-Leninism did, which focused on economic matters which are not of interest to the majority of students. Frankfurt School communism is much more personal in that it can be used to find a whole range of grievances to complain about and to call for communist state intervention to interfere in. Of course, that interference invariably results in the expansion of the role of the communist state, and international corporations, finance and debt. However, that expansion of communist control must also affect the lives of those calling for it. Hence, they also suffer. And so we see the inevitable decline of all aspects of life for those educated, psych-washed masses, starting from the mid-1980s when Frankfurt School communism really started to take hold. And it has been accelerating ever since. This especially confounds younger Western communist feminists, most of all if they are university educated, because they have been so thoroughly psych-washed into believing that these changes were for their good and benefit. Yet reality shows them that they are so much worse off than their parents and grandparents. Communism always devours its own. It is impossible for it not to do so. Moving on to yet another depressing topic, there has been so little or indeed no effective opposition to modern Western communism because the supposed opposition is itself communist, as per Lenin's claim. Western power, and hence Western communism, has declined greatly, of course, but that destruction has been self-destruction, entirely self-inflicted. The fake opposition has played no part in it. All the Western political parties are communist or are led by communists, as are the great majority of so-called independent politicians. 90% plus of supposedly conservative or right-wing social media political commentators, especially those on YouTube, are communist. Scrump Monkey explains this very well and in detail in these and other videos on their channel. Probably the most obvious way to know if a person or organisation or YouTube channel is conservative in name only is to note what they say about the 3 or 4 fundamental concerns of present Western communist leaders, not the concerns of the rank and file followers. These are wars, currently in Ukraine and the Middle East, but previously in Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, etc., the United Nations and all its agencies, and debt and deficit financing and spending, and the role of large corporations and central banks in the creation of that debt. They criticise such terrorist groups as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hamas, etc., but fail to mention that these groups were created by the United States, United Kingdom, French, Israeli governments, etc., and are funded, armed and trained by them. They also support both American and British imperialism and present-day German-French imperialism, that is, the EU. Instead, they focus on issues of no real significance to the communists with actual power, that is transsexuals, illegal immigration, feminism, climate change, Islam, and so on. Like all communists, they have their cover stories in place to fool the gullible and ill-informed, to make money for themselves and to get attention and publicity whilst covering up their real motives and beliefs. The rhinos with the largest audiences often appear on each other's shows or have a common circulating group of guests who all push the same cover stories, partial truths and lies. Support for international finance, whether it be Zionist or non-Zionist, is another indicator that they are fake conservatives. Back prior to the 1980s, there was a claim by communists living in the West that elections offered us a choice between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, which was basically correct. Nowadays, we have a choice between Tweedledum and Tweedledum. This chapter on maths and science is obviously going to be the most difficult and least understood of any part of this already complicated and detailed video. Very few people have any real understanding of these matters or any real interest in them, which is understandable. Therefore, I will try to speed through this section, outlaying the core principles and supplying the necessary evidence and references without trying to explain matters for those who have no experience of what is being discussed. And that especially includes mathematicians and followers of scientism who wish to keep believing that their delusional theories are scientific. Generally speaking, what Western academics and so-called scientists believe is not just non-science, it is anti-science. A fundamentally important reason why that is so is because they use simple, linear, reductionist and static maths and logic in a world that is non-linear, dynamic, complex, and affected by the psych-washing of each and every Western person interested and involved in maths and so-called science. The tools and beliefs they have been educated to use in their academic specialised fields preclude them from being able to comprehend the truth. Their psych-washing doesn't just stop them from comprehending reality in their chosen area, it makes it extremely difficult for them to comprehend political and economic reality as well. Hence their active support for the current communist genocide in its multiple forms. That is why this particular chapter is necessary. Fortunately, this task is helped by the fact that the errors and mistakes made keep being repeated. So once they are recognised, it is a relatively easy matter to see them and make the necessary, invariably wholesale corrections. However, what results is nothing like anything that Western academics and mathematicians believe or accept. So their capacity to deal with reality is usually so damaged that they are incapable of facing up to reality in any shape or form or field. I shall begin with Albert Einstein because the lies told about his work, its validity and what he actually wrote are so blatant that he is an excellent starting point for this subject. Everyone interested in these matters knows that Einstein claimed that the speed of light is a constant, but that is a half-truth at best and is simply not true in reality. He did state in his Special Theory of Relativity, published in 1905, that the speed of light was a constant, and that was a fundamentally important aspect of his theory. However, when he came to his general theory of relativity, published 10 years later in 1915, he stated that the speed of light was a variable. This video explains the situation very clearly. His change of position was far too late, however. The Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887 had proved, quote unquote, that the ether did not exist, according to mainstream physicists. But now Einstein piles terminal insult upon terminal injury by stating that the ether does exist after all, fresh from him having recanted on his claim that the speed of light was a constant. Since Western so-called scientists in this field had already loudly and publicly proclaimed both the death of the concept of the ether and that the speed of light was a constant, Einstein's change of heart was simply ignored as though it had never happened. They went into a state of denial, even though this was the supposedly great scientist and genius Albert Einstein. In scientism, as in communism, a person is only great and an expert, quote unquote, if they further the aims and belief in that dogma. No matter who they are and their past status, if they no longer follow the party line, they are purged or cancelled. In Einstein's case, they just pretended that he still believed what he had said in his special theory of relativity 10 years previously. As we shall see, followers of scientism love their constants. Another example of scientism's fanatical desire for simplicity is the equation E equals mc squared. Here is a quick summation of the once again blatantly obvious flaws in that nonsense equation. Einstein's equation is meant to show how much energy can be derived from a given mass of certain fissionable materials such as weapons-grade uranium, plutonium, etc. When such an explosion or release of energy takes place, the mass of the fissionable material is known. The amount of energy released is unknown. Einstein's equation was used to claim that a nuclear bomb using a small amount of fissionable material would release huge amounts of energy to devastate an enemy city, for example. The equation was used to try and justify the cost of the Manhattan Project by the United States in World War II. Of course, neither Einstein nor anyone else had any idea of how much energy would result from such an explosion, or even if it was possible, because no one had ever even tried to do such a thing. So it was completely made up, speculative and theoretical. The term C relates to the speed of light or electromagnetic energy in two basic forms. One is light itself, which is given off by the explosion, and the other is the energy given off in the form of various types of radiation emitted by the fissionable material. It is scientifically acceptable to use the one term C to represent both these forms of energy because they are both electromagnetic in nature. However, an atomic blast also gives off large amounts of energy in the form of a blast or pressure wave, heat and sound. None of these are electromagnetic. Therefore, the equation needs to include the energy given off by the pressure wave, the sound wave, and heat. We shall say that pressure is represented by P, sound by S, and heat by H. Therefore, the equation should now be E equals mc squared plus P plus S plus H. Properly speaking, C and P and S and H should all have time variables added to them, since the time that the energy from the atomic explosion lasts varies in each case, as does the distance from the blast that the energy affects. The latter is not so important here though. For example, the light output energy lasts for a very short period of time, the sound for a different period of time, the heat for another period, the pressure wave for another period, and the various types of radiation for a variety of periods of time, depending upon their half-lives. All this is far too complicated and messy for believers in scientism, as they ignore such realities. As for the c² part of the equation, it is pure fabrication. No empirical evidence exists to show that it, or the whole equation itself, is correct, as all such events involve the release of variables which the equation omits, as explained. It could just as easily be c³ or c to the power of 5.2 or anything else, but it is c² because that is as simple as it could be, and that is what matters. Now, followers of this nonsense equation claim that scientific tests confirm its validity, but if you understand the tests they reference, you will realize that they are not testing the equation E=mc², but a special and limited case aspect of the equation with a test or tests that are carefully and selectively chosen and conducted in such a way as to make it appear that the results do actually prove that E=mc² makes sense and is accurate. In fact, this and similar experiments are tautological in multiple different ways. They are absolutely tautological in that it only concerns itself with energy given off in the form of C. So that makes it scientifically invalid unless you can prove that all relevant events that give off energy do so only in the form of electromagnetic radiation of some sort, which is absurd. The explanation is also dependent upon prior claims concerning wavelengths, radiation levels, and various other experiments carried out by other believers in and practitioners of scientism, using the same maths, logic, beliefs, etc. Use different maths, different definitions of all the variables, different relationships, that is, there exists a vast number of chaotic relationships between the variables that are possible, and the results are completely different. The idea or possibility that an equation that Einstein came up with in an attempt to integrate Newtonian theory with Maxwell's mathematics concerning electricity would or could scientifically and correctly predict the energy emitted by silicon and sulfur isotopes in the form of gamma radiation is not scientific. It is miraculous. Once again, this is yet another example of the never-ending and ever more delusional and tautological nature of scientism. None of the claims made on the Wikipedia page shown here concerning Einstein's theory of general relativity are scientifically valid, with one exception. It is true that all of Einstein's theories are incompatible with quantum physics, but then everything is incompatible with quantum physics. The geometry of space gravitational time dilation, gravitational lensing, gravitational redshift, Shapiro time delay, black holes, cosmology, Big Bang, cosmic microwave background radiation, and gravitational waves are all fantasy concepts with no basis in fact, and are all totally dependent on simple reductionist tautological tests which assume what they claim to prove. They omit all and any variables they don't approve of, such as the pressure wave and the sound and heat output from the equation E=mc², change variables into constants with delusional abandon, and use maths, logic and belief systems that give them the results they crave. Carry out the same tests scientifically and empirically, and they all show that Einstein's theories are fantasies. But we don't need to even go that far. All we have to do is to accept his own writings on his theories that the speed of light is not a constant, and that the ether does exist and has an effect on his theories, and it is clear that all his ideas are scientifically untenable. Another closely related matter to Einstein's use of E=mc² is that of the theoretical claim as to the most efficient or effective manner for a mass or body to travel in a non-linear manner, and the actual scientific and empirically tested facts in this field. Formula One is a highly expensive business which rewards success and punishes failure in terms of a high cost structure, and Formula One's constructors' championship payments being based on each team's points gained at the end of the season. Huge amounts of real-time data are collected to try and be successful as possible, to make as much money as possible. Lower performance is also very likely to lead to lower sponsorship payments. All such data shows that the claims of scientism, that is simple linear reductionist theory, do not hold true in reality. The following video and pictures explain this well. The same analysis and evidence relates to all dynamics, whether that be the dynamics of gases, water, the weather, electromagnetism, heat, and so on. There are always multiple non-linear variables and non-linear relationships involved, which provide yet another proof that Einstein's mathematical approach is both incompatible with science and tautological. In other words, he arrived at c² as a result of his chosen mathematical methodology, not for any scientific, rational or valid reasons. Of course, Einstein's attempts to integrate Newtonian and Maxwellian theories depended upon the moving object and the observer of that moving object travelling in lovely, neat, precise, flat and dead straight linear paths or lines, which is why the example of a walking observer watching the object on a moving train is normally used. Tautological or circular reasoning is both inherent and absolute within Western academic circles of all types, not just physics, astronomy, etc. It is an inescapable aspect of psych-washing, and successive generations come with ever more deluded fantasies as a result. Hence we have such nonsense as black holes, dark matter, dark energy, the Oort cloud, etc., and similar fantasies in quantum physics such as string theory, many worlds interpretation, quantum electrodynamics, etc., etc., etc. As time goes by, these ridiculous theories have grown exponentially more absurd and bizarre, as has the mathematics and beliefs of the true believers in scientism. Notice how the explanations given by mainstream academics in these areas all admit that no direct evidence exists to support their claims or theories. It is all inferred or generally accepted by the true believers. An example is the claim that dark energy has been proven through measurements of distant type LA supernovae. But these measurements are based upon theories about cosmic distances and redshift that makes so-called proof about dark energy tautological and hence scientifically untenable. If you have a different theory of redshift or cosmic distances, for example, as others do, then that proof, quote unquote, concerning dark energy disappears, probably into a black hole or perhaps into some dark matter. The further we delve into the mathematics of scientism, the more obvious it becomes just how contradictory, nonsensical and absurd their claims, logic and arguments are. In other words, the more rigour and depth and detailed examination of their mathematical theories and so-called evidence, the more they disintegrate as a result of that scrutiny. These failings have arisen historically, and James Clerk Maxwell played an important part in causing those mathematical fantasies to overcome scientific reality. So I shall turn to his role next. Contrasting Maxwell's approach to electromagnetism with Faraday's, who came before him, and with the dynamics of fluids, as explained by Victor Schauberger, who came after Maxwell, best helps us to understand the multiple failings of Maxwell's use of linear, non-dynamic mathematics in a field that is absolutely and fundamentally non-linear, fully dynamic, multivariable, and with all the relationships between the variables being chaotic. The following article, which has been helpfully highlighted in orange, explains just how contradictory and nonsensical Maxwell's mathematically based theory is. The problem for so-called science was that Maxwell's theory was general enough to be considered foundational and became a model which was followed and emulated by those who came after him, with ever-increasing catastrophic results. Hence we go from Maxwell to Poincaré to Einstein to cosmology and so on. Nonsense piled upon nonsense, fantasies piled upon fantasies, delusions piled upon delusions. And with each generation, the failures and absurdities didn't increase in a linear manner. They increased exponentially and exponentially raised to the power of pi, if you will forgive my very obvious sarcasm. Clearly, mathematics had been used in Western so-called science previously, including by Newton, but no general theory had been developed using mathematics as its basis. Following Maxwell, that changed. The problem was, and is, that the mathematics he used are absolutely and fundamentally incompatible with every aspect of electricity, magnetism, and electromagnetism. Only properly dynamic and non-linear mathematics, which requires modern computers, properly programmed, can have any chance of correctly or realistically or scientifically describing or explaining any aspect of reality, whether it be electromagnetism or anything else, including economics, finance, and politics. In this regard, Maxwell's hexagons aren't vortices. This is a vortice.
At speeds of over 37 kilometers per hour, creating a cauldron of whirlpools known as a maelstrom.
Maxwell's hexagons are nonsense. Maxwell, Poincaré, Einstein, etc. were forced to make a great many simplifications of all aspects of their mathematically based theories, since they were restricted to using pen and paper to develop their equations. Hence their omission of variables, changing variables into constants, using linear logic, reasoning and mathematics, pseudodynamics or statics instead of actual chaotic dynamics, continuous relationships and dynamics instead of discontinuous reality, replacing uncertain reality with explicit and implicit mathematical certainty, and so on. All these failings kept accumulating and now have taken such hold that those who oppose and criticise that approach are branded as heretics, ignored or purged. Even though it is possible for correctly programmed computers operated by real scientists who understand the manifest failings of scientism to be used to correct these compounded mistakes, the chances of it actually happening and science replacing scientism are as likely as anyone ever being able to provide actual scientific evidence as to the existence of a black hole. Since there is literally no end to the failings of scientism, it soon becomes pointless to continue down that descent into infantile nonsense. Therefore, I shall finish this depressing and embarrassing chapter by referring to the works of some real scientists who have provided sensible, testable, and proper alternatives to scientism. Nikola Tesla, Wal Thornhill, David Talbot, Andrew Hall, and the other Electric Universe contributors, Rupert Sheldrake, Gerald Pollack, Bruce Lipton, Steve Crothers, Pierre-Marie Robitaille, Victor Schauberger, Eric Dollard, and Ken Wheeler have all made important contributions to actual science and the correct use of mathematics in their analyses or theories. For those wishing to free themselves from the psych-washing of scientism, the writings of the above-mentioned individuals are a good place to start. There are no doubt others who published in languages other than English, but since I don't understand those languages, these are the people I am aware of. Insofar as Ken Wheeler is concerned, I have found that his explanation of the dynamics of electromagnetism as a whole is not exactly the easiest theory to understand or follow. This is largely because he supplies a vastly different and holistic perspective on movement, time, energy, fields and forces than we are used to. So extra effort is required, in my experience. The first thing that needs to be made abundantly clear here is that the perspective or argument or theory that I put forward in this chapter is a matter of belief. There is no proof, scientific or otherwise, that supports this perspective or viewpoint, nor will there ever be a proof or proofs to support or justify such beliefs. One must actually choose to accept or believe in or follow these mentioned beliefs, and that is the point. I shall elaborate on these matters as we continue. It is also helpful to understand that the issues arising from communism and scientism are more due to a lack of morality, decency, and right or good intentions, and a lack of courage, than from a lack of intellectual ability or knowledge or understanding. Nor shall I try to explain or justify these beliefs other than in the most perfunctory manner, if at all, since doing so is a waste of time. If a person cannot understand the reasons for accepting these beliefs, or at least seriously considering them, including the existence of the unconscious, for example, then this whole video and this chapter is not for them. There are a huge number of Eastern and Western teachings on these psychological or spiritual or religious matters which can be used to educate oneself here, if that is required, which it shouldn't be. These are very basic, common sense and obvious beliefs, though less so now than they were in the past. Genocidal communism has taken hold in the West due to the lack of physical, emotional and intellectual courage to stand up and oppose it. This combines with a lack of decency, morality and regard for the truth, and enables self-destructive communist nonsense to spread and destroy. More than enough people in the West know what is happening. There is not a lack of knowledge or understanding. There is a massive lack of morality and courage in dealing with both communism and scientism. There are two additional problems or requirements that need to be explicitly mentioned and acted upon. One is that both communism and scientism are shadow aspects of our psyches or consciousness and can only be productively dealt with in the proper manner. That is, they both need to be recognised, understood for what they are, and we need to accept our responsibility in allowing these genocidal and nonsensical ideologies, including mathematical ideologies, to take hold. The second is the tautological nature of authentic spiritual or psychological teachings or traditions or teachers, both in terms of choosing which traditions are authentic or not, and correctly or effectively or usefully or productively implementing those practices. To deal with these very real issues is a process, not something that can be achieved by realising that we have been lied to and can now recognise some or many of those lies, or as people say today, to wake up. Waking up is a process or journey which takes years and requires actual physical, emotional and intellectual changes and work. Grossly suppressing the importance of emotional and physical maturity and development just leads to deluded intellectual fantasies that arise because we are physically and emotionally immature and undeveloped. And that is why almost all Western academics and intellectuals have fallen for communism and scientism, or just go along with it. Traditional religious texts all warn us that if we lie to others or have hatred for others or wish to genocide others, we will be lied to by our unconscious or God or the universe, and we will experience hatred ourselves and we will genocide ourselves and others. That is what we are experiencing in the West now and have been experiencing especially since 2021. Since the mid-1980s, and especially since the start of the COVID genocide, the shadow side of Western nations has become amazingly apparent or exposed. And that has all been self-exposure in a truly extraordinary manner, including the fake opposition or rhinos showing their true colours. Mixing truth with lies, as communists and followers of scientism do, always kills truth. Truth cannot coexist with lies. Truth will not drive out or destroy lies. The lies will contaminate and destroy the truth. What matters is not the tools or words or maths we use. What matters are our intentions and morality and courage. Frauds and liars will knowingly and deliberately include some truths, but then twist those to support their ideology. Anyone can use dynamic, non-linear, holistic, historic analysis, including mathematical equations or theories, to try and promote or support simple, linear, reductionist nonsense. People with bad intentions and morality can use and twist evidence or mathematics or logic to promote and implement their lies and ideology. We must be prepared to study lies, cover stories and manipulations to recognise them. For example, Wikipedia is liarpedia, and many people have realised this and hence avoid it. But that is a mistake, in my opinion. We need to recognise at least some of the various types of lies and false claims that Wikipedia and other such mainstream gatekeepers make about themselves and their propaganda. Then we can deal with their procedures and practices and learn from them. They specifically distort or avoid certain subjects or are sensitive to certain issues, and that helps inform us as to their actual motivations. For example, Wikipedia is very sensitive about anything that is hostile to or criticises modern medical practices and beliefs, and that is very understandable today. In general, academics / scientists / mathematicians / intellectuals claim to be logical, disciplined, rigorous and rational, but are in fact irrational, fanatical, illogical and emotionally bound to linear, reductionist and usually mathematically based simplicity arising from centuries of past mistakes and errors. People such as Santos Bonacci and his attitude to syncretism, Max Egan, T.E.K., the enlightened Kiwi, David Icke and Rupert Sheldrake all provide good psychological and spiritual advice which relates sensibly and practically to current Western life. There is also James Corbett of the Corbett Report, who has been doing excellent work in these areas for decades. All these men have been warning us for years, and in some cases decades, about the self-destructive, genocidal individuals, governments and groups who have destroyed the West. Their warnings are usually couched in psychological or spiritual terms that are much better understood in the East than the West, but that is because Western thinking is so delusional and self-destructive. Given the preceding chapters of this video, and especially the previous chapter on psychology and spirituality, it is necessary to examine Western feminism in light of what has been documented and explained before. This means looking at feminism whilst implicitly and explicitly including the shadow side of the feminine and its exposure or revelation since the 1960s. There are many Western feminists who believe that what we have seen since the 1960s is the rise of the divine feminine, and that is true if we understand divine, quote unquote, as including the shadow side or aspects of our consciousness and behaviour. Then their claims are certainly correct. Females can't have equality without facing up to the feminine shadow side. This must be accepted and integrated, and that requires being adult. Unfortunately, we have seen just the opposite, and as a result, Western females have happily and proudly lined up to be exploited and genocided in a most astounding and extraordinary manner. And this goes back to the late 1700s and to the 1840s in the United Kingdom and the United States.
Or
But
race
when do you
or
think that it
any
started?
other inborn characteristic. But well, I think that my argument is that unfortunately, this idea that the early feminists were good-hearted women who simply wanted equality, unfortunately, that isn't true. It may well have been that there were individual feminists who felt no dislike of men, but the movement as a whole always was a very angry movement. It always expressed the conviction that men from the beginning of time had really done nothing other than oppress and subjugate women for their own pleasure and profit, that men hated women, that men feared women. It's right there in 1848, if you go back to what is sometimes considered the first women's convention and the first declaration of women's rights at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a series of Quaker women friends of hers penned a declaration of sentiments. Their thesis in that declaration was that the history of mankind is the history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward women, having as its object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. And then that's, it goes on from there in that fervid kind of manner. It doesn't admit that men ever acted to protect women and children. It does not admit that any aspect of the building of civilization, any aspect of the gender order as it developed naturally because of men's and women's different capabilities and roles, that it developed in order to protect women and children and to provide for them, or that it developed according to the basic, biologically based natures of men and women. It did not admit that at all. And I have not found any significant statement by a feminist since that time, or even earlier, if you go back to 1792, to Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, it also breathes the conviction that women have been oppressed and oppressed only by men, always denied their natural rights, always treated with contempt, always treated as the other, as Simone de Beauvoir declared in 1949. It's just there in every phase of the feminist movement. Deep anger, a special loathing and repulsion for male sexuality, a conviction that the family is the site of women's oppression. Early feminists, back in the 1850s, used phrases like sex slavery to describe the position of women in the family and in marriage in particular, of course. And also this conviction, as I say, of female moral supremacism, that if women ran the world, women would do a much, much better job. No recognition that men have ever acted with benevolent intentions towards women.
So,
Thus, Western feminism from the very start was a classic case of projection of female shadow aspects onto certain males. Not the powerful patriarchal males, but males that these middle-class females generally considered beneath them. In spiritual or psychological terms, these middle-class females were at war with their masculine aspects, which they then projected onto parts of society, including females who opposed their deranged and self-destructive delusions. As history shows us, these delusions result in the genocide of others and the genocide of oneself. Communism, and especially Frankfurt School communism, has fed and promoted these delusions to try and further their aims, which has amplified and hastened the self-destruction of the West. Inevitably and necessarily, Western feminists have suffered the most from feminism, since they suffer from the internal psychological effects of being at war with their masculine aspects, at the same time as the communist patriarchy have used their power to exploit and genocide them, their businesses, their children and grandchildren, their living standards, their health, and all aspects of their existence. Western females are extremely susceptible to communist psych-washing from the patriarchy due to their hypergamy. Hypergamy here means their desire for themselves and their children to rise to ever higher levels of social standing, power, income, and status, not just their desire to be involved in a relationship with a person whom they consider is superior to their current, somewhat significant other. Instead of attacking or criticising the actual patriarchy, which they want to join instead of destroying, they actually attack males they consider are beneath them and of no value to them. They also like to be noticed by males and females they aspire to join, and so we get acts like these. The actual patriarchy is 50% female, of course, and those females benefit greatly from belonging to those powerful family clans. This is what the feminists want for themselves. These patriarchal females all practice, espouse and promote typical patriarchal values and despise matriarchal values. On occasions they may pretend to publicly pay lip service to them. They certainly actively promote feminism as they created it and use it to exploit and genocide females outside the patriarchy, and very successfully too. Feminists invariably promote and support the wars that the patriarchy creates, except in cases where males useful to them or family members are in danger of being forced to fight via conscription. This is what happened in both the United States and Australia during the Vietnam War, and both governments learnt from that mistake and started using other means to recruit their cannon fodder. Here are two videos that give further information on the role of the patriarchy in promoting feminism and why it did so, and also the effects of the COVID death jabs on women's health.
He was at the house one night, and we were talking, and he started laughing. He said, "Aaron, what do you think women's liberation was about?" And I said, I had pretty conventional thinking about it at that point. I said, I think it's about women having the right to work, getting equal pay with men, just like they won the right to vote, you know? And he started to laugh. He said, "You're an idiot." And I said, "Why am I an idiot?" He said, let me tell you what that was about. We, the Rockefellers, funded that. We funded Women's Lib, you know? And we're the ones who got all over the newspapers and television, the Rockefeller Foundation. He says, and you want to know why? He says, there were two primary reasons. And they were, one reason was we couldn't tax half the population before Women's Lib. And the second reason was, now we get the kids in school at an early age. We can indoctrinate the kids how to think. It breaks up their family. The kids start looking at the state as the family, as the school, as the officials, as their family, not as the parents teaching them. And so those are the two primary reasons for Women's Lib, which I thought up to that point was a noble thing. You know, when I saw their intentions behind it, where they were coming from when they created it, the thought of it, I saw the evil behind what I thought was a noble venture.
In relation to the role of the Rockefellers in promoting feminism so as to genocide its true believers, here is some further relevant information.
But getting back to people waking up, I do think that we are now at the pointy end. I have a friend she goes to critical incidents in Melbourne, and she's seeing huge problems with women losing babies in the 7th month. Topher Field interviewed a woman who was a funeral director, and she was saying that she used to do 1 stillbirth a month, and now she's doing 4 a week. And apparently what's happening is that the placentas of the people who've taken the vaccination are inadequate. So many of the problems are associated with clotting, and of course the placenta is full of blood vessels that clearly aren't operating properly, and they're getting what's called a floppy placenta, which is not nourishing the babies properly. The babies are very small for dates, and by the time they hit the 7-month mark, they can't be sustained anymore and they're being lost. And this friend said that she's going to a lot of heartbroken young mums who are losing their babies. I also interviewed a naturopath at Mandy a couple of weeks ago, and she said she's been very aware of what's happening. She's had a lot of patients who've come to her. Initially, they were having all sorts of neurological problems, she said, but now it's fertility problems. Men who have sperm that just doesn't work like sperm normally works, and women with fertility problems that are becoming really apparent now. Well, so many young girls have said to me that that they've had horrible constant bleeding and things.
Well, that was the first thing.
Another factor is the cost of implementing, promoting and maintaining Frankfurt School communism in the West. Just like all communism, woke communism has been forced on the population by the state, large international corporations, mass media, etc. An example of how this has been done is the role of diplomatic missions and bodies such as USAID. Hundreds of millions of dollars, pounds and euros has been spent by all Western governments over decades to psych-wash their populations, and especially children, into accepting this absurd self-destructive nonsense. I have already commented on the old saying that history is agreed upon lies, and there is another old saying that the victors write the history. Since the victors in the West have always been communists, we can correctly and truthfully say that history is agreed upon communist lies. There are few subjects where this has been more true than in the lie that before feminism, females were kept in the kitchen and stopped from working. Anyone who has studied the economic and political history of any Western nation knows that that is nonsense, as the following evidence clearly shows. government census data in gross domestic product, net national product, national income data, etc., is a major source of information on the actual situation. The most relevant and historically accurate fact that this article mentions is this. For every middle-class female who was forced to stay at home and work in the kitchen, and many middle-class females were indeed in that situation, there were 2 to 3 times as many females from all classes of society who wanted to stay in the home and work in the kitchen, amongst their other duties and responsibilities, who were forced by economic necessity to leave the home and work full-time or part-time in occupations they did not want to engage in. And that includes working in family businesses that their mothers and grandmothers had been running for generations. This article by economic historian Ivy Pinchbeck, PhD, explains the situation very well. All the evidence and data and explanations supplied here is what was taught to students of economic history such as myself at Western universities prior to the communist march through the institutions. At the end of World War I and World War II, many Western women went from some kind of essential military work in factories, driving trucks, nursing, etc., not back into the home, but back to their previous civilian occupations and businesses. Only a small percentage went from their homes into military support roles and then back to their homes and kitchens. But the books and articles on all such subjects are invariably written by middle-class males, and now females, who only see things from that very partial and hence erroneous and ideological perspective. There's usually only a small number of economic historians and/or anti-communists who publish the facts about female participation in the workforce in Western industrialized nations. Related to the issue of females working is that of the communist patriarchy and their feminist followers belittling and demonizing kitchens and working in the kitchen. This is by design, deliberate and planned, and has been massively pushed, as it is an important mechanism for enabling the communists to break down the family structure and exploit and genocide people. This then empowers the communist state. It makes people dependent upon that state rather than the extended family as they have been in the past. Of course, the females and males of the patriarchy are totally family orientated and intent upon building up and expanding the wealth, power and prestige of their family group or clan by all means possible. The kitchens of the wealthy and powerful are large, very well equipped, expensive and well stocked with high quality food. Often experienced, capable chefs, usually male, are employed to cook meals for the family and any guests they have joining them. They will sometimes have kitchen assistants, usually female, who insist in the preparation of the food and cleaning the kitchen and kitchen utensils afterwards. Some of these kitchen staff are employed full-time and others are hired just for special occasions. Whilst this means that wealthy female members of the patriarchy don't have to slave away in the kitchen unless they wish to, it doesn't in any way undermine the importance of kitchens. In fact, it adds to and signifies their importance. In the past, families eating together was a major part of creating family bonds and unity, as was preparing food for those meals as a family, with both female and male children being actively involved here. Having families eating from poisoned fast food outlets instead of eating home-cooked meals breaks down the family bonds, adds to family health issues, causes them to become more dependent on communist government health systems, and expands the role of the state in their lives. Hence the feminist attacks on and criticisms of females being in kitchens, unless they happen to work for them, of course. What all the preceding history of feminism shows us is that since the 1960s, 90% plus of Western females have moved away from the divine feminine and much closer to the wounded feminine in every way possible. This is sad, unfortunate, and disturbing. In summary then, and this relates to all aspects of Western females' lives, including their spiritual or psychological lives, the following Soviet-era saying is highly relevant. In capitalism, females exploit females. In communism, it's the other way around. I have slightly updated that particular saying to take account of modern sensibilities and practicalities. We can now finally move on to something in the West that is positive and constructive, and that is MGTOW. Due to decades of the many highly self-destructive behaviours, practices and attitudes that occurred in the West from governments and global corporations forcing Frankfurt School communism onto society, a very small number of disparate individuals, mainly male, started to try and oppose, criticise and provide a practical, viable alternative to communist ideology. MGTOW is composed of individuals who have their own opinions on a variety of subjects. It is not a political movement or a movement of any kind, like men's rights activists, for example, nor an organisation. It has no leaders or spokesmen or women. No one speaks for MGTOW, and hence my thoughts on the subject are purely my own opinions. Other MGTOW contributors have very different opinions on these matters. Obviously, this is extremely different from communism. MGTOW contributors include Unde Chronic, Kevin Samuels, Dr. Helen Smith, Sandman, Karen Strawn, Professor Janice Fiamingo, Betta Batchelor, Dr. Bettina Arndt, Hammerhand, Gonzalo Lira, Rich Cooper, Hugh Mann and Cassie J, to name just a few that I am aware of. There are a large number of related and interdependent issues that various MGTOW contributors have explained, analysed and discussed. They are generally reviled and attacked online and in the mainstream media due to three reasons. They examine and expose the shadow side of Western females and feminists.
You know why I think girls like bad boys? An emphasis on boys. And I think a lot of people assume that women are putting down guys because they're so irresponsible. And that might be true. I think women like bad boys because bad boys allow them to stay in the world of fantasy, drama, and irresponsibility. The nice guy insists that she sobers up, that she live in a drama-less world of pedestrian coming home to dinner, sitting on the couch, doing the mundane things of day-to-day life like you would as an adult if you're on your own, being responsible. The bad boy allows her to lead an irresponsible life full of drama and also fulfills her shopping change of new guys, new parties, new possibilities. The nice guy asks her to settle down. It's that the nice guy is the less childish guy. That's where I think the key is. Another thing to consider as well is, what does she see in the bad boy? I think she sees the bad girl. She sees in him the bitchy attitude, the rebellious attitude she was used to with the girls in the schoolyard. She sees some self-referential part of herself in this guy. She can relate to the arsehole. I think the instinct is she likes bad boys because the bad boys don't ask her to grow up, because they're irresponsible children themselves. And I think in some way it gives women an air of superiority, like they're more in charge because he's just a big dumb brute. So I think the proximal reason, the here and now of why they feel, not how they think into the future, but why they feel now that they would rather be with the bad boy, is that yes, he's not afraid, but more importantly, he's childish, and it allows her to stay young, to be a child, to be irresponsible, to have fun, to never choose, to never be responsible for a choice, because deep down she knows a choice with the bad boy is never going to be a permanent one.
They criticised the role of the communist state in the breakdown of families and society, and they discussed the role of woke or Frankfurt School communism in causing the present genocide of Western populations, the destruction of Western economies, and the corruption of Western institutions such as the legal, educational, and medical so-called professions. In terms of all the issues raised by the various MGTOW contributors, it is up to you to look into any that may interest you. This video by Gonzalo Lira may help with some issues. Two MGTOW contributors who have supplied their own unique descriptions of current Western societies that are particularly relevant, in my opinion anyway, are Kevin Samuels and Gonzalo Lira. Gonzalo Lira, or Coach Red Pill, was an American citizen born in the United States of German Chilean heritage. He was an anti-communist who lived in Chile during some of the Pinochet period years. Gonzalo lived and worked in New York and was familiar with the New York publishing industry due to being an author himself. He was living in Kharkiv, Ukraine, posting his YouTube videos on various political, economic and social matters when the Russian special military operation began. Being red-pilled, he was critical of the role of the United States in the 2014 Maidan coup and the actions of the Biden government and its Ukrainian supporters once the US took power in Ukraine in 2014. He was first arrested by the Ukrainian police, the SBU, and released awaiting trial. He continued to criticize the actions of the West in Ukraine. He was rearrested trying to flee the country and murdered by the Americans inside a Ukrainian prison in January 2024.
And so instead, 10 days later, just days before he was due back in court, he got on his motorbike with all the belongings he could carry and, like a character in one of his books, sped 1,300 kilometers across Ukraine.
Started as a free speech issue. But because of the SBU and the inherent corruption of the SBU and the criminal justice system in Ukraine, I will definitely be sent to a prison labor camp where I will most certainly die. And so I decided that the smart thing was take my chances in terms of getting across the border. Right now, I'm maybe 5 kilometers away from the border. with Hungary.
For the following days, the internet became awash with speculation. Had he made it across? But I knew, really, with that sinking feeling when I saw the video, for what it was, a forlorn bid for freedom from a desperate man who had run out of options. And sure enough, authorities soon announced that he had been arrested again. He spent the following months in jail. The likes of Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk tried to draw attention to his plight. But in February 2024, the news broke via a letter he had written to his sister, saying that he was seriously ill and about to undergo an operation, and that he did not know whether he would survive. He didn't. His death was soon confirmed. Gonzalo's father, amongst others, alleged that he was murdered by the Ukrainian authorities and blamed the US for not helping him.
What they did to my son is an assassination. My son did not have any criminal charges. My son used the power of freedom of speech. And I cannot condone this terrible government that the USA has. The intention was to make them ill and have them die of natural causes. That is what they did to my son Gonzalo.
And months later, in November 2024, more strength to the allegations that he was killed came from the Ukrainian opposition lawmaker Alexander Dubinsky, who stated, "We have come into possession of irrefutable proof that American citizen and blogger Gonzalo Lira was tortured in the Kharkov detention facility. He was beaten in the same way I was in the Kiev detention facility. He was taken to a cell in putrid conditions where they extorted money from him. When he made this public, he was killed."
The start of the genesis of this whole situation is because I had an opinion that went against the narrative. And that's why I went to prison. And that's why, if I'm arrested again, I will die in prison. The American State Department knows exactly who I am and the situation I'm currently involved in. And they know the fate that awaits me. They know it. You know, they have that saying that, I forget the wording exactly. You know, I'm a little stressed out, as you can imagine, but they have that saying that people are fundamentally good, but for evil to triumph, all you need is the indifference of good people. Please don't be indifferent to my fate. I ask you this very humbly. Please recognize that, well, the literal death that awaits me if this doesn't work out.
Kevin Samuels explained to black American women how the US communist government was deluding them into becoming dependent on their programs, that it was not acting in their interests or supporting them in any way, and that it was making things worse for them, their families, and their children and grandchildren. He explained that they were being lied to by the political parties, the NGOs, the mainstream media, and by health so-called professionals, etc. In other words, he was trying to un-psych-wash them, to try and help them to face up to reality. A very difficult task given the wealth and power of those peddling woke communist fantasies. Most of the women who spoke to him on YouTube must have recognised to some degree that things were not right with some aspects of their lives. How many of them acted on his realistic advice is a matter only known to them. His approach built on and was similar to Thomas Sowell's excellent work, but in a more focused and limited manner. He has been criticised for his bluntness in speaking to females, which is rather strange, as it seems his critics are more comfortable with people genociding black women than they are with someone criticising them. MGTOW provides a disturbing, difficult, but also sensible and practical contribution to Western psychology, spirituality, and normal day-to-day life. It very accurately and honestly deals with present Western communist reality, and it doesn't shy away from openly examining our female and male shadow aspects or sides. That is necessary. This makes it by far the most advanced, honest and useful contribution to Western politics, psychology and thought in centuries. It is also the most blunt and upsetting. It is even more developed, general and mature than Jungian shadow work, and hence much more unpopular. It also provides an adult, productive and practical alternative in multiple ways to the manipulative, genocidal lies of the Frankfurt School communists. This live stream with Sydney MGTOW and Sandman, Better Bachelor, Undead Chronic, Hammerhand, Coach Greg Adams and Pop, etc. gives a good general insight into many MGTOW ideas. The idea of this video was to make it clear that those with power in the West are genociding themselves, their businesses, their economies, and their nation states or empires in America's case. Do not allow them to genocide you whilst they are genociding themselves. In this regard, the issue of civil war is relevant. A number of commentators have posted useful videos on this topic which look at past civil wars, revolutions, rebellions, etc. Their suggestions of what to do and what not to do, i.e. be peaceful, no violence, are excellent. However, the West is already in a state of civil war, in my opinion. It is just not the type of civil war that has taken place in the past, at least in the West. Since we now live in communist regimes, it is useful to look at the Soviet Union and its experience with these matters to try and learn from their history. Throughout the great majority of its existence, the Soviet Union was in a state of civil war, and that is normal and inherent within communism, as has been explained. The overt civil war between the Bolsheviks and the Tsarist regime began in 1917, with the Bolsheviks first funded and armed by Germany and then the United States. That conflict continued until 1923, with the British and the French aiding the White Armies and the US funding and arming the Communists. Unsurprisingly, the US Communists defeated the British and the French, who had been decimated by World War I, militarily and financially. Due to the Bolsheviks almost destroying themselves, the United States had to bail them out using the American Relief Administration led by Herbert Hoover. Relative peace ensured until 1928, when the first five-year plan was implemented and the civil war between the Bolsheviks and the peasant population restarted. This was a time of forced starvation and using military power to get people off the land and into the factories, mines, bureaucracy, military, etc. This period from 1928 to 1941 was when the Soviet state was created. Civil conflict was at its worst during Stalin's Great Terror campaign in the 1930s. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 forced Stalin to suspend his genocide of the Soviet population. Once World War II ended, the civil war continued. With Stalin's death in 1953, there was conflict between the old Stalinists and the Khrushchev-led leadership. Only when Khrushchev was peacefully removed and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev did the civil war within the Soviet Union end. While Whilst there was still internal repression and the military suppression of the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, the civil war between the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the general population ceased. With the coming to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 and his political and economic reforms intended to destroy the Soviet Union, the civil war resumed. It reached its peak during the Yeltsin years when the Russian population declined significantly. It was only around 2010 when the Putin government finally managed to get rid of most of the oligarchs that the civil war, which had been inherited from the Soviet Union, was finally ended. Obviously, foreign intervention, predominantly American, featured throughout the civil war between the Soviet state and its population, including after the arranged collapse of the Soviet Union. It is this type of situation which we in the West have been in since the mid-1980s with the implementation of Frankfurt School communism. A major step up of activity occurred in 2021 when all the communist governments forced the COVID death jabs on their populations. Another increasingly self-destructive method by which the actual patriarchy is destroying itself, all its family members, and the people who work for them, is so-called artificial intelligence. The powerful executives in global businesses, governments, bureaucracies, military and security services have been poisoning themselves for generations now, ever since the 1960s with their implementation of the poisons revolution, or what they call the green revolution. As they have added ever more chemicals and poisons to the air, water, earth, medicines and food, and exposed themselves and their families to increasing levels of electromagnetic radiation in a range of frequencies, their mental and physical and psychological capacities have declined. Hence we see their increasingly irrational, desperate and obviously self-destructive behaviours and beliefs. With financial fantasies and manipulations, scams and state-created and sponsored Ponzi schemes, replacing actual experience with real production and productivity, the business and organisational awareness of the patriarchy has disintegrated. PowerPoint presentations, diagrams, charts, computer models, algorithms and spreadsheets and financialized data of all kinds have become their reality. This is clearly apparent when we look at their psych-washed and hence irrational belief in AI. Even someone with only the mental capacity of a lobotomized leech can see that AI is nonsense. A computer or a machine can no more think than can a brick paver or a door handle. All AI is nothing but stupid nonsense for multiple reasons. In the first place, any improvements in so-called AI come from the human programmers in that field, e.g. creating pictures of humans, landscapes, etc., doing a better job of implementing their particular AI model after feedback from users and seeing how their first versions worked in reality, and learning from their and their competitors' efforts, successes and failures. The computer programmers in each field, example, writing an AI program for the computer control of robots in a car factory, have no experience with making those robots and how they operate in factories, so they have to try and learn from the actual engineers in that industry. This is a problem as there are an extremely large number of industries and businesses to deal with, and trying to adapt their AI to work profitably in each business is incredibly complex. Plus, conditions in the economy are always changing, so people and the computer models have to incessantly adapt and change, so that the people in each business have to keep informing the programmers to update their AI systems. What is called AI is nothing more than a slightly dynamic form of programming in a very limited or restrictive manner, usually linear, carried out by humans whose code allows a certain limited range of options or choices for the model to try and adjust. In some cases, the code will make beneficial and successful choices, and in others it won't. Unless there are humans continually watching and checking these things, then errors are just as likely as successes, and cascading failures are probably inevitable sooner or later. In reality, nothing comes for free, and the cost in computing power and the cost in electricity to run the necessary computers is huge. Possibilities of using financial scams to implement and promote AI nonsense in Western financial markets is absolute. Promises and claims are huge, actual profits rather less so, which just means ever-increasing public and private debt and further economic decline. AI is nothing but stupid nonsense, another con and a scam only believed in by the gullible and naive and parasitic, that is, those people who want machines to do everything or as much as possible for them, whilst they live their idle, lazy and deluded lives. Now we can clearly see that the United Kingdom, French, United States and all the other Western governments are destroying themselves in the typical communist manner. France has been in a state of civil war since the first Yellow Vest protests back in 2018, with Western governments and mainstream media at the time suppressing or gatekeeping this information to stop their populations from realising the seriousness of that situation. Following COVID, these conflicts are now being promoted by various Western governments to try and give them an excuse to implement even more communist controls and to speed up their genociding of their populations. They first began spreading hatred towards Muslims, and now they are beginning to do the same to Hindus, after those same governments brought them into their countries for this purpose. This is the typical divide and conquer tactic, which is used to create a problem and then claim that the only solution is more communist state power and control. In the United Kingdom, the communist uniparty state is trying to wipe out the white English race and replace them with mixed and multi-race people. However, in doing so, they are trashing English cities and towns, but government-imported foreigners live in those towns, such as Birmingham, and they are not happy with the destruction and decay of their streets, councils, shopping districts, roads, infrastructure, etc. They are also forced to have the COVID death jabs, along with their kids and grandkids. They were also locked down. They have to put up with the chemtrails, the pitiful NHS, and with woke communism being forced on their children. They are well aware of this and are now abandoning the uni party and putting up their own candidates to vote for. This is just another aspect of the civil war in Western countries. It is impossible to give general advice to people on what to do in this situation, as everyone's situation is very different. Some people can leave the cities, live in the country, and be as self-sufficient as possible. For most, however, that is impossible. Each person has to decide for themselves. Engaging in or advocating violence is the worst thing to do, as it just empowers the communist state, and that is why the communists are trying to promote it so much, as the aforementioned YouTube videos point out. One of the most relevant and dangerous aspects of this ongoing and worsening civil war is the use of medicines and medical practices to make people ill and eventually kill them. Therefore, it would be remiss of me not to mention the role of the United States in the Spanish flu genocide following World War I and the AIDS-HIV genocide of the 1980s. The COVID scam is their third attempt at this particular form of a communist killing frenzy. In summary then, try and make sure that the communists do not kill you and your family whilst they are destroying themselves. Unfortunately, it is difficult to get most people in the West to face up to what is happening, so our warnings fall on deaf ears. We can only try. Here are acknowledgements for the pictures, photos, diagrams, etc. that I have used throughout this video that have not had their source information attached to them. This especially applies to the pictures and photos I used in the introduction. Please note that this picture of Lenin is bogus or fake, but I have included it as an example of how communism works in practice. I have found out that this quote from Stalin is also fake, and we can't even trust the words coming from the mouths of two great communists such as Lenin and Stalin. It is a very sad state of affairs indeed. I would appreciate it if anyone who has any knowledge or suggestions where the following videos or writings may be found would post a comment here about these matters. To the best of my recollection, which isn't the greatest in my old age, these are some details which will hopefully help you identify the sources I am looking for. Most of these videos were once on YouTube, but I have not been able to relocate them after failing to screen capture their details at the time. Some sources are from 20 or more years ago and may have been made before then, but only uploaded to the internet at that time. Thank you.